Philip Bradley's The World Reimagined, Americans and Human Rights in the 20th Century, is a pivotal work that examines the evolution of human rights discourse in the United States, tracing its development from the early 20th century to the end of the Cold War. Bradley explores how Americans have engaged with human rights, often shaped by political, cultural, and ideological shifts. His book provides a nuanced understanding of how human rights were framed, adopted, and sometimes resisted within U.S. domestic and foreign policies. Introduction to Bradley's argument. Bradley argues that the concept of human rights did not hold a central place in American political thought until after World War II, even though ideas of rights and liberties had been integral to U.S. identity since its founding. He suggests that the early 20th century saw human rights largely discussed in relation to domestic civil rights rather than as a global concern. The atrocities of World War II, particularly the Holocaust, played a crucial role in shifting this perspective as they forced Americans to reckon with the need for international human rights frameworks. Bradley's analysis focuses not just on policymakers, but also on cultural figures, activists, and intellectuals who shaped human rights discourse. He argues that the way Americans conceptualized human rights was often refracted through their own national experiences, particularly through the lens of race and democracy. The emergence of human rights discourse. In the early 20th century, human rights were not a prominent feature of U.S. foreign policy. Instead, American international engagement was more focused on imperialist expansion, economic interests, and traditional diplomacy. Bradley highlights that figures like President Woodrow Wilson promoted ideas about self-determination, but these were often inconsistent, applied selectively, and primarily served U.S. strategic interests rather than universal human rights principles. Bradley also discusses the limited role of human rights in the interwar period, showing how the U.S. failed to act against fascist aggression or address colonial oppression. It was only with World War II that the rhetoric of human rights gained momentum, as the global devastation and the exposure of Nazi crimes made clear the necessity of international human rights protections. World War II and the birth of human rights in U.S. thought. Bradley devotes considerable attention to the period during and immediately after World War II, when human rights began to take on new significance in U.S. political and cultural discourse. The Atlantic Charter of 1941, signed by Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, outlined broad principles of self-government and economic freedom that hinted at a human rights agenda. However, as Bradley points out, these ideas were often in tension with existing racial segregation and colonial policies that both the U.S. and Britain maintained. One of the most significant moments in the development of American human rights discourse was the founding of the United Nations in 1945 and the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, in 1948. Eleanor Roosevelt played a crucial role in shaping this document, positioning the U.S. as a leader in the emerging human rights movement. However, Bradley underscores the paradox that while the U.S. championed human rights abroad, it continued to tolerate racial discrimination and segregation at home. This contradiction would fuel future debates over America's commitment to human rights principles. The Cold War and the selective use of human rights. During the Cold War, human rights became a tool of ideological competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Bradley explains how American policymakers selectively used human rights rhetoric to criticize communist regimes while downplaying or ignoring human rights abuses by U.S. allies. Remained disenfranchised at home. Bradley explores how international criticism, particularly from newly decolonized nations in Africa and Asia, pressured the U.S. to address racial injustice. The 1970s marked a turning point, as human rights became a more formalized aspect of U.S. foreign policy. President Jimmy Carter is often credited with making human rights a priority, condemning authoritarian regimes regardless of ideological alignment. However, as Bradley notes, this commitment was inconsistent, as the U.S. continued to support allies who violated human rights, such as Iran under the Shah or various Latin American dictatorships. Human rights in the late 20th century, triumph or decline. By the late 20th century, human rights had become an established part of global political discourse, but their effectiveness and sincerity remained contested. Bradley examines how the Reagan administration's policies reflected both an embrace and a rejection of human rights rhetoric. While Reagan strongly criticized human rights abuses in the Soviet bloc, his administration also supported right-wing regimes involved in severe violations, such as in Central America. Bradley argues that by the 1990s, human rights had been firmly embedded in U.S. foreign policy, but their meaning had become increasingly flexible. The end of the Cold War allowed the U.S. to promote human rights without the constraints of ideological competition, yet inconsistencies persisted. Humanitarian interventions in places like the Balkans were justified on human rights grounds, but failures to prevent genocide in Rwanda and ethnic cleansing in Bosnia revealed the limitations of America's commitment. Cultural and intellectual contributions to human rights discourse. One of Bradley's strengths is his exploration of how cultural and intellectual movements shaped American perceptions of human rights. He examines the role of literature, film, and journalism in creating awareness of human rights issues. Books like Night by Elie Wiesel and films about the Holocaust played a crucial role in cementing human rights concerns in American consciousness. Similarly, journalistic coverage of atrocities in Vietnam, Latin America, and Africa made human rights abuses more visible to the American public. Bradley also considers the impact of feminist and LGBTQ movements on human rights discourse. The rise of second-wave feminism in the 1970s expanded the definition of human rights to include gender equality, reproductive rights, and protections against domestic violence. Likewise, the AIDS crisis of the 1980s and 1990s highlighted issues of discrimination, leading to broader debates about health and human rights. Bradley concludes that while the U.S. has been a major proponent of human rights on the global stage, its approach has often been inconsistent and self-serving. Human rights rhetoric has been used both to promote genuine reform and to justify political interests. Bradley does not dismiss American contributions to human rights, but instead urges a more critical understanding of their historical complexities. In the world Reimagined, Bradley offers a compelling and well-researched analysis of the evolution of human rights in American thought. By examining the intersections of policy, culture, and activism, he provides a nuanced perspective on the successes and failures of U.S. human rights engagement. His work is essential for understanding not only the history of human rights, but also the ongoing challenges in achieving true global justice.